Hey guys, where are we today?
We're in Green Bay!
She's excited. Today we are doing a kind of a Q&A video. We've gotten a lot of questions about how we boondock, how often, how we find all this free camping, so we want to answer that today. We also want to talk about potential plans for going to Alaska. We've had some questions and we invited His and Hers Alaska onto the show so that they could answer some of our questions for us.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that. But first, we are going to talk about dry camping in an RV and also how to find free camping places.
I think before we get into this discussion about how we find places, we should just quickly talk about how we dry camp. We've met a lot of people who feel almost afraid to dry camp, especially for more than a night or so. They're either afraid for security reasons, they're afraid they're not going to have enough battery power, or how they're going to sustain themselves. And I think the first thing everyone needs to do is just realize it's just like being at a campground. You just have to be a lot more aware of how much water you're using. If you're not plugged into any sort of power, making sure you run the generator or at least monitor the batteries and know when you need to turn the generator on to recharge them. And then, just enjoying being where you are. Find really cool spots. We'll talk about that. But the essence of boondocking is being able to get away from campsites and kind of out in the wilderness at places that you would love to take a camp, but now that you have an RV, why not take the RV to that same location? So that's really what we're going to talk about today.
Mm-hmm. And I would say boondocking is probably some of my favorite camping experiences that I've had.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we've been to some fantastic places and we weren't around a bunch of people. Sometimes there are kids running and screaming through a campground, which at many times it's to be expected. I mean, families come out, the kids want to run around and play. We have no problem with that, but we like to be out in the middle of a forest.
And there's just something so nice about being disconnected too. Oftentimes these places are very remote. There's no internet access, there's no cell coverage, and it's just really peaceful. And sometimes you just have to get away.
Now, I think the second thing we should address is security. That seems to come up quite a bit. I think a lot of it comes down to personal beliefs and where you feel or don't feel safe. For us, we both grew up in Los Angeles. Our last house was actually in a very bad neighborhood of Los Angeles where we had police helicopters circling around literally a couple times a day, if not. Yeah.
And the first week we moved in, there was a police raid about 2 blocks away.
Yeah. And that kind of, hearing a gunshot in our neighborhood was not uncommon.
No.
So for us, when we say a place is safe, our idea of safe might be completely different than what you're used to.
And an example is Milwaukee.
Yeah.
We had a few people tell us that Milwaukee is not a safe area. We get there and it's totally fine. I didn't feel unsafe at all.
No. And we kind of had to chuckle a little bit because, again, what we consider to be unsafe is a completely different level of what some other people might consider unsafe. So, our advice to you, if you get somewhere, you park the RV, you get out, I would say drive around the neighborhood just to get a feel for it. And if you don't feel comfortable there, you're probably better off leaving. There's only been one time on this entire trip, and that was in Lafayette, Louisiana. We pulled off the 10, we parked at a Cracker Barrel, we drove around the area, and what we saw in that area told us to get out. Don't stay there, leave, find another place. We were actually considering getting back on the highway. Luckily, we found another Walmart that was a few miles from there and a completely different neighborhood. Sometimes it just takes, driving a few miles away to find a nice area. But again, it's really personal preference and something you need to decide, is this safe or is it not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we do travel with a wolf-looking, fierce, white fluff ball, and sometimes people cross the road because they're afraid of him.
Yeah.
Because he's got his mouth open and they think he might eat him, but little do they know Leo doesn't have a mean bone in him.
No.
But, that's something to keep in mind too.
It is. So the first thing we want to talk about are those short one-night stays that we do every now and again.
Yeah. So a lot of times we're traveling through a town or we're making a long trip across the country and we just need a place to spend a night. And there are businesses and places where we can do that, such as Walmart, Cracker Barrel, truck stops, rest stops, depending on the state.
Yeah, make sure you check state laws on that.
Yeah.
Cabela's, and sometimes street parking as well.
Yep, street parking. Make sure you check with the city. I did write an article about dry camping or boondocking in an RV, and it does go through a list of all the businesses that allow overnight parking for RVs.
Mm-hmm.
We will link to that here. And we also did a separate video about boondocking at Cracker Barrel, which you can watch as well. And I would say in general, if you're going to do overnight parking at a business such as a truck stop or Cabela's, Cracker Barrel, call them in advance, make sure that they can accommodate you first, and ask for the manager. They're the best people to talk to. And the other great thing is if you let them know you're going to be there, then they also know that you'll be spending the night. And if for any reason something happens, they're aware that you're there.
Yeah, and it's also good to ask the manager where the best place is to park. For example, we've been told when we call Walmart, like, hey, park over by the garden center along the far parking lot and you'll be fine. Other times they say park wherever you want, we don't care.
And sometimes you'll call and they're going to let you know, oh, we're repaving the parking lot,
mm-hmm.
and you shouldn't come because we're fencing off the parking lot today, or there's road construction going on. So those are really good information to have going in. And if it happens to be 90 out and you need to run your generator, it's good to ask for permission, as well as if you can put your jacks down.
Yeah, and one thing we like to do so we don't leave any trace or whatnot is we got Haas pads. They're a very heavy duty rubber pad. We just did a review on them. We will link in the description below. But we always put those under our jacks so they don't leave any sort of indentation in the asphalt. And if someone comes by to look who works there, they can see that we're taking the time to try to protect the ground from our metal jacks. Now, if you do call and the manager tells you you're not allowed to park there overnight, try a few other businesses in the area. We've been in places like Colorado that have a lot of laws against parking overnight. Whenever we called a Walmart, they always told us we don't allow it because of city ordinance. Now, Cracker Barrels tend to own their entire parking lot, and they can essentially do whatever they want. So we would call a Cracker Barrel and they'd say, sure, we have no problem with you parking here overnight. So always call ahead, make sure to talk to a manager and find out what you can and cannot do.
And if you're thinking about staying at a rest stop, check the Department of Transportation website for that state, and they will have information on whether you can spend the night. Also, if you pull into the rest area, there will always be posted signs about their rules against or for overnight parking. I did write a post about spending a night at a rest stop that we will link to as well.
But for those of you heading to Florida for the winter, don't expect to stay at any rest stops. They don't allow overnight parking, and they are very strict about it.
Yeah, and they have a 4-hour limit from what I remember.
Mm-hmm.
So you can take a quick break, but you better get back on that road.
Another cool thing to note is for the Cabela's that will allow you to camp overnight, a lot of them have designated RV parking. Same as Cracker Barrel, they have great parking spots. But Cabela's also has a Sani dump, typically, or right next to the RV parking. It is $5 to dump your tank, and you know, for the most part, that's a great deal when you're going through a town and you need a place to dump.
And I also wrote a post about Cabela's that we will link to as well.
Now, the last form of short-term parking is actually camping. There are two services out there that offer people like us the opportunity to spend a night or two at a business or a personal home. One is Harvest Hosts. They're a network of wineries, breweries, museums, those types of places that have big parking lots and they have the room to accommodate a couple of RVs. They'll typically allow you to spend a night or two in exchange for going into the business and buying things there. But a lot of times it's there for you to camp overnight. You can typically put your slides out, put your jacks down. Occasionally they'll have power for you, but all of the Harvest Hosts we've stayed at have been fantastic people, fantastic places, and we couldn't recommend doing that more if that's the type of thing you enjoy doing. The other one is Boondockers Welcome. That is a network of people who have large driveways or properties where they can accommodate RVs, and they will let you come in for a period of time to actually boondock on their property. Each person is going to be different as to what they allow, but the cool thing about Boondockers Welcome is you can go on there, message with the people, tell them what you're looking for. They will tell you if they can accommodate it and for how long.
And although we haven't stayed with a Boondockers Welcome member, we've reached out to multiple people. The timing just hasn't worked out.
Yeah. And it actually seems to be a very popular service now that we're reaching out to people. We've reached out to a few and they say, well, you know, we're booked up through this period. So, you know, it's a cool service. Definitely look into it. We highly recommend Harvest Hosts. But let's get into long-term camping.
Yeah. Now on to our favorite type of boondocking or free camping in our RV, and that's on public land. The two most popular are BLM, so Bureau of Land Management, and Forest Services land. And the reason we love public land is because usually it's a 14-day limit and you get to park out in beautiful remote areas throughout the US, although mostly on the West Coast. And it is just such a wonderful experience to be on your own out there, not relying on water or electric hookup, and just getting away.
It's essentially glamping. So that is glamour camping in your RV. We're going to a lot of the same places that a tent camper might. Now, we don't get as far back because we don't want to drive our RV on some of those roads, but we get back there. We are out in the middle of nowhere. One of the greatest spots for me was when we went to the Grand Canyon and we found some boondocking spots outside of the park, out in the middle of the forest. It was beautiful. There were elk going by. We saw all sorts of animals, and we could just sit outside, relax, and enjoy the view, and not have people crowded in around us. Now, when you are out on BLM or Forest Service land, keep in mind that, for example, when we were at the Grand Canyon, it was hunting season, so you could hear gunshots in the background. You know, there are very specific rules, but that's something to take into consideration when you're camping out there. If you start hearing gunshots, it's not a bad thing. People are hunting. They do a lot of target shooting, either out in the desert or out in the forest. You're not allowed to shoot across a road, so if you're near a road, that's usually a good thing. The further you are out there and the more camouflaged you are, the more problematic it could be. So just keep that in mind when you're going out in the middle of nowhere.
Now, one of my favorite camping spots was out near Flagstaff, very close to Walnut Canyon Park, and I loved it there. The washboard road that we had to drive on going 5 miles an hour was rough, but once we got into our spot, it was beautiful. We even saw a cougar, our first cougar ever, and that was so neat. But I will say, you know, there are ranchers out there who have their cows roaming freely, and every once in a while we would get home and there would be a few cows roaming around the RV. Luckily, they never attacked the RV.
We heard a story about someone we know where a cow ran into the RV and was like headbutting it.
In the middle of the night.
Yeah, and there's also another story from a gentleman that had, he had chrome all around the bottom of his RV, and a wild turkey was walking by, saw its reflection in the chrome and start attacking the side of the RV. This happens because you're out in the middle of nature, so you have to be prepared for stuff like that. But the reward is being out in the middle of nature and all the beautiful surroundings you have, which you don't get at a campground.
Now the big question is, how do you find these spots? We use multiple resources. One of them, and you've heard me mention this many times, is the All Stays Camp and RV app. There is a filter on there where you can look for free camping options, but you can also search specifically for public land such as BLM or for Forest Services, and that's a great resource. But the other one is freecampsites.net.
Yep.
They have some really great resources. The issue I've found with them is a lot of the feedback and information is provided by tent campers, so they access a lot more places than RVers would. So it's always good to do your research.
Now the last, and what we think is one of the best resources, is going to a ranger station. They know the areas better than anyone else. They're usually out there all the time. They can tell you what road conditions and things are like. But they have specific maps that outline where the different boondocking areas are, where private property is, where you can and cannot cross. So we always stop in at a ranger station. Even if we know the areas we're going to, we'll still check in with them and see what the conditions out there are like. which brings us to our next point. Before we try to take the RV into any of these areas, we will typically find a supermarket, Walmart, some place we can park the RV and leave it. We'll take the Jeep and start scouting out the different roads. We found a lot of times that, anecdotal stories about some of these great campgrounds don't include what the road is like. And if it does, it's typically, as Kate mentioned before, from a tent camper who's taking their car or their Jeep down there and they have no problems with the road. But when we try to drive our, 20,000 pound RV down that same road, it's a completely different story. So we always like to scope out roads. We're checking for clearance when we come in and out of the road. A lot of times there's a rut along the road and we don't want to get stuck in that. We check to see how muddy things are, how sandy things are. Tree branches, bushes along the side, all sorts of things like that. We also look at the area and try to see what water runoff looks like. Because if it rains while we're there, we don't want to be in the middle of a valley or something that turns into a giant mud pit when it rains, and then we can't get the RV out.
And the other thing to keep in mind is different RVers will have different comfort zones on what type of road they will access. And people who have tow behinds will usually, we found, access roads that are a lot rougher that we're willing to go down.
Yeah, and we've seen some RVs in some pretty crazy situations. They will go up and over rocks, all sorts of things that we would never want to take our RV on. So again, this is one of those things that comes down to personal preference and where you're willing to go. But in general, I will say the Forest Service fire roads tend to be really well kept and some of the best areas that we've found to boondock.
We've written about all of our favorite public land camping spots on our website. You can head over there and go under our campground reviews, or we will link to it below so you can check them out.
Now on to Alaska. Since we've gotten on the road, we have talked about going up to Alaska. I believe
before we even got on the road.
Yeah, before we even got it. That was like the one place that everyone says you have to go and visit. But on the flip side, we keep hearing stories about frost heaves, giant man-eating mosquitoes, all sorts of crazy weather, things happening at the border crossing, whether or not we'd be able to get Leo in. There's always these myths and everything behind, going up to Alaska. It's like the last frontier. We've even heard stories about, people driving up there and not being able to get gas or all sorts of other problems. So we figured we would reach out to His and Hers Alaska. They have a fantastic YouTube channel. If you haven't already, check it out, subscribe. But we reached out to them with some of these questions and asked them to provide some answers based on, what they've seen going back and forth from Alaska to the lower 48.
Yeah. And Ben and Rebecca live in Alaska, so who better to ask than people who live there? And they just did a grand trip down to the lower 48, so they've been through it very recently.
Yeah. So here's what they had to say on the matter.
Hello, Russos. It's great to hear from you guys. We are Ben and Rebecca from His and Hers Alaska, and we can help you with those questions, but there's one problem. It's something we can jabber and rattle on about for like a half hour. So we're going to do our very best to answer your questions in a matter of a couple minutes. First question, what are the road conditions like?
Well, contrary to popular misconception,
or even past, because it was true in the past.
In the 70s and 80s, and maybe even the 90s, the roads were pretty intense on the way up here. But these days, you just have to worry about one stretch between Destruction Bay and Tok. Other than that, for the most part, you're going to see well-paved roads. You may have some frost heaves from the winter time or some potholes. But
it's nothing that would ever stop us from visiting Alaska if we live in the lower 48.
Exactly.
That would not even be a factor for us.
No. And our rig has done really well both times we've driven up and down.
Yeah.
So Ben, the next question they had was, what about gas? Do you have to worry about running out of gas between stops?
Pretty much if your vehicle can make it 200 miles, you have nothing to worry about. We tend to get fuel in our motorhome at like the 400 mile mark, and that still leaves us like a 150 mile cushion. So yeah, that's really not an issue. You can use your card at all the pumps 24 hours a day. Not a factor at all.
Just don't pass the gas station and you'll be fine.
Yeah, or know what lies ahead. What's the cell phone service like?
So we have used AT&T on the way down and Verizon on the way up. So we can speak to the two largest carriers in the nation. Both did quite well. Verizon has a better package for Canada, so if that's an option for you, choose Verizon.
It's like $2 a day and you get to use your plan like normal.
Yeah. As far as coverage goes, for the most part, you can expect it in all large cities, and you'll have data in those bigger cities.
Now, cities is a relative term.
That's true. Towns.
Towns, yeah.
Once you get past Whitehorse in the Yukon, then only expect it in the towns. And don't expect to have really high level data. You're going to have some cell phone service so you can make phone calls in, Whitehorse, Haines Junction, Beaver Creek, places like that. In between, don't expect a lot of service and don't expect it to be LTE glowing service.
Yeah, but the risk is worth the reward. And like I said, that would never stop us from taking the trip. So in conclusion, Russo's, get your butts up here in 2017.
And you'll never regret driving the Alcan. It's actually, there is something very magical about making that drive. Stop at the hot springs, see the natural beauty. There's amazing wildlife on the drive up here. You won't regret it.
Yeah.
Come join us.
So right now, we're in the middle of nowhere, and if you want to find out what we're up to today, you're going to have to subscribe to our channel, His and Hers Alaska. We'll see you guys on the trail.
Thank you, Rebecca and Ben, for taking the time to answer our questions.
You guys are awesome.
We really appreciate it. And for those of you who are watching, I hope you got some good information out of this video. I think we should probably head up to Alaska.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe summer 2017 because this winter we're going to be back on the West Coast visiting family in Los Angeles. We're going to go up through Washington and Oregon. So naturally we might have to just keep on going. Ben,
maybe.
Rebecca, you might see us this next summer.
Yeah. And hey, maybe we'll have a We're the Russos Alaska caravan. If you want to join us, let us know.
Seriously.
The more the merrier, right?
Yeah. Or we get that 4x4 show hauler and we just...
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll happen one day.
One day. And if you have an Earth Roamer you want to lend us, we'll take that too.
Oh, yeah. Earth Roamer, Sportsmobile. What was the one the guy messaged us about?
Oh, a Unicat.
Oh, Unicat. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Serious money.
Joe has been drooling.
I have.
That. We might be trading this for an expedition vehicle. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video on free camping. And if you have further questions, feel free to leave a comment and we'll try to address them in a future video.
Bye, guys.